It's always such a delight, the first lecture of the first week, kicking things off. So here we go with the Ireland of Yeats and Joyce. So the first thing I want to put out there is that this program is as much about a country as it is about two of the defining figures of that country, the Ireland of Yeats and Joyce. And both Joyce and Yeats were shaped by Ireland, just as they themselves shaped Ireland. So let's begin with this question. James Joyce is born in 1882 in Bray, a sort of coastal suburb outside of Dublin. Into what sort of world is he born? What did Ireland do to help shape the young James Joyce? The first point to make is that he is born into a land and a history of oppression and rebellion. And Tim is going to go into much more detail about these sorts of things. But this is a country that had not known freedom and independence since the Reformation. So Joyce is immediately born into a world in which oppression and rebellion go hand in hand and are sort of the subject of everyday life. In recent memory, there had been the 1798 Wolfe Tone Rebellion of the United Irishmen. In 1803, Robert Emmet's Rebellion. In 1848, the Young Ireland Rebellion. In 1867, the Fenian Rebellion. In the 1880s, the Land Wars. In the 1890s, the Home Rule Movement. This is did you get all those dates quick? Did you get those right now? They're all in the timeline. This is a country saturated with resistance to the rule of Protestant imperial Great Britain. Now, James Joyce is defined by his commitment to liberation and to freedom. And it is no accident that he is born into a world in which that freedom is restricted. Joyce's commitment to freedom is personal, spiritual, sexual, artistic. It's the driving impulse of James Joyce, and I think inseparable from the political world into which he was born. Also in recent memory, the trauma of the Great Famine, perhaps the defining event of 19th century Ireland. From 1845 to 1849, an impoverished countryside dependent on a single crop suffer 4 years of starvation that left millions dead, millions emigrated, and nearly destroyed the Irish language. Joyce almost never writes directly about the Great Famine, but there are multiple scholarly works that talk about the ways in which the famine underlies everything that he writes, and I'll give some examples of that as we move along. The role of the Catholic Church. Catholicism is associated with the national cause. Daniel O'Connell in 1829 attains Catholic emancipation and is forever after known as the Great Liberator. And the 19th century is the time of Catholic resurgence, of great church building, its influence in nearly every facet of Irish life. Of course, the Catholic Church also is keenly repressive, controlling of sexuality, marriage, language, and eventually even of what could be read and discussed. And after Irish independence in the 1920s, Ireland would become almost a theocracy, and censorship would be a powerful reality of Irish life all the way into the 1970s. Joyce's impulse towards freedom always put him at odds with the church. And the relationship between Joyce and the Catholic Church is a complex relationship. Hence, in Ulysses, Stephen Dedalus will state, "I am the servant of two masters, an English and an Italian, the imperial British state and the Holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church." And here he is very much articulating his creator's view, Joyce's view, the servant of two masters and always trying to elude those two masters. I'll share with you a few images. On your left is one of the murals in the Falls Road area in Belfast in Northern Ireland. That picture is about a decade old, commemorating the famine and its impact on nationalist or republican life in Ireland. Ireland's Holocaust, Britain's genocide by salvation. And then on your right, what did I say? By salvation? Thank you for the correction. Yes. I was joking with Tim. He's there to heckle me at will, but also to correct my mistakes, which I appreciate. Britain's genocide by starvation. And then the magnificent famine memorial in Dublin, right on the Liffey in front of the Custom House, very haunting presentation of the legacy of the famine. Now, let's talk a bit about the Irish Renaissance. This course could be called the Irish Renaissance instead of the Ireland of Yeats and Joyce, or it could be called the Irish Revival. And I mentioned this a bit yesterday. This was the great outpouring of art and culture and literature that began in Ireland in the late 19th century and continued through the 1920s. It is one of the richest periods of artistic creation in European history. And it is a key component of the worldwide phenomenon known as modernism. Now, arguably the two most dominant figures in both the Irish Renaissance and modernism are William Butler Yeats and James Joyce. There are also a host of satellite figures in the Renaissance: Shaw, Wilde, Gregory, Synge, Hyde, Purser, Russell, and many more. And you'll hear of them in a number of our remarks today. So I just want to kind of set that idea that Yeats and Joyce are key figures here, but they're part of a much larger constellation of literary and cultural figures during this time. So where did this revival come from? And what led to the context for the work of Yeats and Joyce? First, a rise in national consciousness. The 19th century is sort of the period of great nationalisms, and Ireland very much partakes in that, particularly in the wake of Catholic emancipation, when nationalism and Catholicism are almost synonymous in Ireland during this time. An increased economic confidence and the emergence of a Catholic middle class. The Joyce family would be part of that emerging middle class. A renewed interest in the ancient language of Irish, the oldest vernacular in all of Europe. And an interest in Irish folklore, Irish myth, Irish spiritualism. And an effort to find that authentic, ancient Gael or Irish identity, and to recover that spirit for a newly empowered Ireland in the 20th century. The hope that there was an authentic Irish identity separate from the British identity that had been imposed upon it. And this would become a hotly contested issue in the Ireland of this time. I'm going to give three quick illustrations of the Irish Renaissance and the figures of Anthony Raftery, Nathaniel Hone the Younger, and then inspired by James to talk about a book. Anthony Raftery was a blind, wandering poet of the early 19th century. He composed his poems in the Irish language. He didn't write them down. They belonged to the ancient oral tradition, that ancient Irish poetic tradition that, as Lady Gregory said, had existed before Chaucer was born. That poetic tradition was given written form first by the Irish monks in the 6th century AD and going forward, often in the very margins of their holy texts. It had been suppressed by the English occupation as the great houses and poetic patronage were destroyed, and then preserved only by these homeless wandering poets like Raftery. Lady Gregory, in effect, discovered the poetry of Raftery. He became a kind of obsession for both her and for Yeats as the authentic Irish poet, a kind of icon for the Irish Renaissance. Let me move to the visual arts. In the 19th century, Irish visual art had a kind of rebirth. A series of great Irish landscape painters emerged, influenced by European Romanticism, trained both in Europe and in the new Royal Hibernian Academy, Ireland's first academy for the visual arts. And they found in the beautiful, majestic Irish landscape unique possibilities for their art. There are many figures here we could mention, but Nathaniel Hone, from 1831 to 1917, is a wonderful example. He brought the insights of French Impressionism to the Irish landscape. And here's one of his famous paintings, Pastures at Malahide. And I would just emphasize here what he does with the land and the sky. The eye is drawn towards the immediate landscape, the greens and the rustic, but also drawn upwards. 2/3 of the canvas is given to the sky, drawn upwards to that if you've been to Ireland, you know that blue sky means rain is on its way. And here come the clouds very close. But this romantic, tempestuous, and yet also realistic kind of landscape. If you think about realism and symbolism, it's a very good way to think about the work of James Joyce. And then I did promise I would mention a book. In 1888, a book appeared called Poems and Ballads of Young Ireland. And it came from a circle of writers associated with John O'Leary, the old Fenian rebel. And one of the main contributors was a young poet, just over 20 years old, named William Butler Yeats. And one could say that with this book, the Irish literary revival begins. So it's into that context that James Joyce comes of age in the 1880s and 1890s. And now for the rest of the week, I'm just going to talk about James Joyce. Please don't distract me. I'm just going to stay focused on this remarkable writer. Now, to many scholars, James Joyce stands as the most important writer of the 20th century. Certainly when we talk about the Irish revival, although there are many figures in this movement, the two titans are Yeats and Joyce. By most accounts, Yeats is the greatest poet of the 20th century, and Joyce is the greatest novelist of the 20th century. And I offer those not as opinions, those are facts that are given. Certainly for me, Joyce is the most influential writer in how I conceive of literature and what I take to be the aims and meanings of great writing. Joyce changed the way I understand literature, and in many ways was the writer who is most signal in inspiring me to become a professor of literature. Along with Shakespeare, Joyce is the most important writer in the English tradition. And if you don't agree with that, well, Joyce himself agreed with that assessment. Indeed, certainly by the 1920s, he felt he had surpassed Shakespeare and found himself in rivalry, perhaps only with the authors of the Christian Bible, which meant he was in rivalry with God, which is a very good way to think about the aspirations of James Joyce. Yet Joyce definitely did not see himself as part of the Irish revival movement, to which Yeats, Gregory Sing, and others were so committed. Indeed, he mocked the Celtic Twilight School as the Celtic toilet in his last book, Finnegans Wake. Indeed, many scholars don't even speak about Joyce as a specifically Irish writer. He is usually placed among the titans of European modernism, that movement of literature and art that runs from about World War I until the outbreak of World War II, that includes such major figures as Joseph Conrad, T.S. Eliot, Thomas Mann, Franz Kafka, Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, Virginia Woolf, and many others. One major scholar has called that entire period the Age of Joyce. So pronounced was his influence on the other writers of this era. But as I said last night, although Joyce is a defining figure in European modernism, he is a quintessentially Irish writer. And in fact, we cannot fully understand the work of James Joyce without understanding him as an Irish writer. Joyce was born 17 years after Yeats and 30 years after Lady Gregory. So although he belongs in the same era as these other writers, he is at least a half generation younger. And indeed, he saw himself as a younger challenger to their writing. When Yeats and Joyce first met in 1902, when Yeats was already the preeminent poet in Ireland, and Joyce was a 20-year-old upstart who had only written a handful of slender lyrics, Joyce, at the end of their meeting, asked Yeats how old he was. Yeats reportedly shaved a few years off his actual age, but even so, Joyce responded, "It is as I feared. You are too old. I have come too late to help you." When it came to his writing, Joyce was a supremely confident young man. His father belonged to that rising Catholic middle class. He'd owned property in County Cork through inheritance. And when Joyce was young, his parents lived a very comfortable upper middle class life in the fashionable seaside village of Bray, complete with a fine house and servants. They were wealthy enough to send James, at the remarkably young age of 6, off to one of the finest Catholic boarding schools in the country, Clongowes Wood College. When the family's financial situation declined, he was enrolled at another Jesuit school, Belvedere, in Dublin, where the young Joyce distinguished himself as one of the best students in the country, winning national prizes for his essays and achieving particular note for his gifts with languages. Both Clongowes and Belvedere were Jesuit academies, and Joyce received a superb education. Indeed, along with John Milton, he is perhaps the best educated, most learned great writer in English literature. Joyce's Catholicism is absolutely central to his mind and makeup, one of the very few writers of the Irish Revival who in fact was Catholic. From an early age, he was drawn to the details, complexities, and mysteries of Catholic faith and theology. Like his character Stephen Dedalus, he considered a vocation to the priesthood when he was young. But the servitude he felt the church demanded of him was impossible for Joyce. He was constitutionally unable to submit to any sort of external rule. Again, for Joyce, the prime value was freedom, and this included freedom of his spiritual conscience. So he turned away from Catholicism and the worship of God to the worship of art and the vocation of the artist. And this becomes the paradigm for modernism. In the place of God and the religion in which they could no longer believe, the modernists substituted art as their sacred object. And the life of the artist replaced the life of the priest as the pathway to the divine. Yet this does not mean Joyce was an atheist or an unbeliever. As one recent book maintains, Joyce is a misbeliever. He maintained a fascination with the spiritual world every bit as profound as that of Yeats, though their conceptions of that world would take vastly different forms in their writings and their lives. Now, though Joyce was born into relative affluence, his father's fortunes quickly declined. John Joyce, alas, was drawn towards drink and away from work. And his fortunes rested largely on political favor, particularly those involved in the Home Rule movement and the fate of Parnell. So with the fall of Parnell and the change in political fortunes, the family declined. They were soon forced to move out of their fine home into increasingly impoverished homes, finally making the decisive move across the River Liffey from the south side of Dublin, the place of wealth and imperial government and established families, to the north side of Dublin, the place of crowded tenements and the working poor, of the overcrowded dwellings and the urban underside of the city. And those early chapters of Portrait chronicle that move to the north side in exquisite detail. By the time Joyce was 20, that family, now grown to 10 children, of whom James was the eldest, was living in a 2-room cottage in an obscure lane in the north of Dublin. And his mother was dying of cancer. His father, now an unemployed drunkard, was incapable of providing for the home and the children. And in 1898, Joyce committed himself to the life of the intellectual and the artist. He enrolled in University College Dublin, the relatively new Catholic university established by Cardinal Newman, to serve the growing population of Catholics who are entering professional life. And here you see what had been University College Dublin, of course, is now a thriving university in the South Dublin suburbs, and the remarkable Byzantine church. This is one of my favorite tours to take in Dublin. You have to do it privately, but it's a magnificent place to tour, and they have still preserved 2 of the classrooms from Joyce's own day, including the physics theater, in which the 5th chapter of Portrait has a remarkable conversation in that room that we'll look at later in the week. The university was crucial for Joyce. It helped him broaden his education even further, but he also began his life as an autodidact. He discovered the work of the great Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen and taught himself to read Ibsen's work in Norwegian. How does one do that? And yet there he was translating the work on his own. He read widely in European philosophy and aesthetics and literature. And again, he was becoming part of that movement of modernism, really before modernism itself had begun. So let's talk a little bit about modernism to situate Joyce and Yeats in this larger context. Modernism emerges in the early 20th century as a counter to the general optimism and sense of progress of the 19th century. The 19th century, with its achievements in science and medicine and humanistic studies, its relative peace, seemed to augur an era of continuous improvement of the human condition. The emergence of liberal theology in the wake of the German Enlightenment argued that humanity was gradually getting better at attaining God's will, and that our ethical and humane characteristics were growing more godlike and less savage over time. To many, war seemed at an end, and an ever-improving human condition was on the near horizon. All of this changed with the eruption of the First World War in 1914, the year James Joyce publishes his first book of fiction, Dubliners. The First World War gave the lie to the myth of human progress. In the horrors of the trenches, it became impossible to believe that humanity was improving, that we were getting closer to living the way God intended. Quite the contrary, the war revealed to many that just the opposite was the case, that humanity was becoming more and more devilish with each new invention. This was the war that employed all of the new technologies of warfare for the first time: the machine gun, the tank, aerial bombardment, biological weapons, long-distance artillery. For the first time in human history, you could destroy tens of thousands of men at a time without ever seeing their faces. By the war's end, more than 17 million soldiers and civilians had been killed. So World War I, that experience colored modernity. No longer could one write under the assumption that humanity was improving in its ability to be just or ethical or loving or faithful. Modernity looked into the abyss of the human experience, what Conrad called the heart of darkness that many saw within the human soul. This was the spirit that drove Eliot's great poem of 1922, comes out the same year as Joyce's Ulysses, The Wasteland, and its argument that the world was a spiritual waste, a valley of dry bones. Modernity also emerged in the wake of the great questioners of the 19th century: Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud. These radical thinkers were breaking the boundaries of their own time, and they really gave definition to the thought of the 20th century. Marx questioned the very structure of Western society, especially our ideas of class and power. Nietzsche questioned history and power and emphasized the irrational drives that he felt lay beneath civilization, our Dionysian frenzies that would oppose our Apollonian efforts at mastery. Darwin seemed to overthrow the very order of nature, with humans no longer occupying that place of prestige in the creation. And Freud, perhaps the most radical of them all, showed how our apparently controlled and conscious life was an illusion. That in fact we are driven by impulses, desires, and traumas that exist at the unconscious and subconscious levels where we hardly even glimpse our true selves. This was the intellectual world into which James Joyce emerged as a writer. In August of 1904, he published his first story. Also that year, he finished what would become his first book, a collection of poems titled Chamber Music that he would publish in 1907. But most important of all, In 1904, he met and fell in love with a woman from the west of Ireland named Nora Barnacle. In October of that same year, he and Nora left for the continent, and though Joyce would return to Ireland a handful of times in the following years, he would never again live in Ireland for the rest of his life. His career as a writer in exile had begun. For the next 35 years, Joyce and Nora would live in Europe apart from Ireland, and yet for all those 35 years, in every book he produced, Joyce would write only about Ireland. His first book of poems, Chamber Music, was set entirely in the Dublin of his youth. His second book, Dubliners, is about the world of Dublin at the turn of the century. His third book, Portrait, begun in 1904 and published in 1916, is an autobiographical novel that mirrors Joyce's own childhood and young adulthood in Dublin. His next book, Ulysses, sets the story of Homer's Odyssey in the Dublin of 1904. And his final book, Finnegans Wake, takes its title from an Irish drinking song and tells the story of a Dublin pub keeper and his family. Again, small wonder that when asked in 1933 if he might return to Ireland, Joyce replied, "Have I ever left it?" Now, Joyce had initially gone to Paris in the winter of 1902 and 03. Lady Gregory had written him in October of 1902 and had said, "Why don't you come to Coole Park and we can talk over your interests and your ideas?" And had he gone to Coole Park, in Yeats's words, what would have shaken from the sieve? That could have changed everything if he had come under Gregory's influence, immersed himself more in the Irish Renaissance. But no, he rejected that invitation, and instead he went to Paris. He immersed himself in the bohemian life of Paris, reading obsessively in its great libraries, developing his theories of art and literature, and focusing his aesthetic beliefs, which came to replace the Catholic theology that had once obsessed him, and beginning the careful poetic compositions that would form his early poems. And those early poems of Joyce are exquisite lyrics. They're almost as bare as an Emily Dickinson poem, but like Dickinson's work, crammed with thought and detail and extremely careful writing. My book on Joyce is on his early poetry, and it's astonishing that there could be such a thing as an unexplored vista in Joyce studies, but in fact the early poetry was that. And I spent years working with great interest on those early poems and really finding all kinds of things going on there that were fascinating. He had to come back to Dublin in the spring of 03 because his mother was dying of cancer. And when she asked her son to kneel and pray for her as she was dying, he refused, steadfastly insisting that he would not serve even God. And though this seemed to Joyce a heroic commitment to his art and his conscience, this choice haunted him for the rest of his life. And his avatar, Stephen Dedalus, sees in Ulysses the ghost of his mother, arising from his guilt-stricken conscience, much as Joyce himself likely saw. Now Joyce found himself in his father's house with his siblings in real poverty, with no clear future before him. He could have gone into journalism and written for the Dublin newspapers, which seemed to Joyce to be a crass prostitution of his artistic gifts. I rarely make that point when my journalism colleagues are around. This is how Joyce viewed the craft. It's not my view. He could have gone into teaching or taken a clerkship. Again, to Joyce, this would mean embracing bourgeois comfort while sacrificing his sacred duty to his art. And then in June of 1904, he was crossing Grafton Street near Trinity College, and he met a young woman from Galway in the far west of Ireland. And he asked her name and made an appointment to go out walking with her the next day. She didn't show up. She stood him up. So he followed up with another request, and she agreed to that one. Nora Barnacle had come to Dublin that year, as many Irish girls did in the early 20th century, coming from the western countryside to the big city, seeking more opportunities than her constricted Irish country life could provide. They were an unlikely couple. Joyce, hyper-educated, driven and ambitious and guilt-ridden, conscious of his extraordinary talent and anxious to show his country how great a writer he was. And Nora, not well educated, though certainly intelligent and in many ways far more perceptive and insightful than Joyce. Not urban nor sophisticated, but worldly wise, and especially far more adventurous and confident sexually than Joyce himself. Joyce, seeking direction and feeling the loss of his mother, found in Nora the ideal female companion. She would become to him muse, lover, mother, friend, and confidant, and she would inspire the incredible array of female characters throughout his fiction. She gave him his first true experience of love, and this, I am convinced, made possible his ability to compose his magnificent works of fiction. Neither Joyce nor Nora wanted to be confined to Ireland, where social judgment and the Catholic Church would never allow them to live together unmarried. And Joyce was convinced that he could never express himself artistically in the constraints of Dublin. And so they left Ireland and settled in Trieste, Italy, a city much like Dublin in that it was an international port city with a thriving blend of languages and cultures and a complex history of occupation and resistance. In Trieste, Joyce would finish Dubliners, write Portrait, begin Ulysses, while he and Nora had 2 children and lived their complex and challenging life together. And let me share with you a few more interesting images. That is the confluence of Grafton Street and Nassau Street in Dublin right around 1900. That's the street that Joyce was crossing when he met Nora Barnacle. And if you keep looking down that street, even today, you see on the gable end of this building on Leinster Street, Finn's Hotel. It was in that hotel that Nora was working as a chambermaid. And that's where Joyce left the note for her to come out walking with him. And I tell my students when we're there, look down, look at what it says on that building more than a century later. That image is the very heart and soul of both Irish and European modernism. No Finn's Hotel, no Nora Barnacle, no Dubliners, no Portrait, no Ulysses, no Finnegans Wake. And then I reassure my students that that would be a bad thing if we didn't have those books that they're getting ready to read. Now, these are a few images in Trieste. 2 years ago, I was able to go and lecture in the Joyce Summer School in Trieste, and you got to go to the place to understand it. It just revealed to me what this place was like in Joyce's life. You still see the same magnificent European architecture. And is that sky not a Nathaniel Hone landscape? I mean, sea, land, sky, you can see some of the same things that, Joyce felt very much at home in Trieste. That, in some ways, that's Dublin Bay. That's the Hill of Howth from where the image was taken. This, on the second full floor, is the first apartment that Joyce and Nora lived in. It looks sort of magnificent today. They were in real poverty. They were living hand to mouth for a number of years. But marvelous to see the place where they had lived. Whoops, I don't want to do that yet. Okay. So it gives you a sense of that world in which they lived. I'll leave that image up there. Now, Joyce began his writing career as a poet, composing poems that were a combination of Irish balladry, Elizabethan lyrics, 19th century romanticism, and in places, proto-modernist verse. These formed his first book, Chamber Music. But he knew he could never rival his countryman Yeats as a poet. I gave you that scornful quote of Joyce, "Oh, you're too old, I can't help you." Joyce at times would distance himself from Yeats, but there is no writer in the 20th century for whom Joyce had more respect than Yeats. He recognized his greatness. He sent one of the first telegrams of congratulations when Yeats won the Nobel Prize for Literature, an honor Joyce would never attain. Recognized Yeats's greatness, though also made very clear how different the two were in their imagination. When Yeats's 1899 volume, The Wind Among the Reeds, appeared, Joyce saw that Yeats had emerged as a master poet. And he also realized, Joyce did, that poetry was not his true milieu. He needed the more expansive form of fiction. He longed for a larger, fuller canvas on which to paint his many thoughts. And he also saw that lyric poetry was too personal an expression. Joyce always needed the ironic distance of multiple voices and authorial pose. In the summer of 1904, he published his first work of fiction, a short story titled The Sisters, in George Russell's nationalist journal, The Irish Homestead. And this story would become the first opening story in his collection, Dubliners, and we'll look at this in some detail tomorrow. Dubliners was finished in 1907. It wouldn't be published until 1914. Publishers were absolutely unwilling to publish these scandalous stories. They bordered on the indecent. They had suggestions of premarital sex, of out-of-wedlock pregnancy, of sexual predation, of excessive drink, of child abuse, and more. In short, Joyce's anatomy of modern life was seen as too real to be printed. And he labored for 7 years to bring the book out in its true form, always refusing to censor or revise what he saw as his true rendering of Dublin life. In this, he was very much akin to another contemporary and rival, John Millington Synge, whose plays provoked riots in the Abbey Theatre, and Synge always refused to alter what he saw as a true rendering of Irish life. After completing Dubliners, Joyce never wrote another short story again. He'd mastered that form, and so he left it behind. He turned to his first novel-length book, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. He brought that out 2 years later, in 1916. He had mastered the form of the novel, and he never wrote another again. He then turned to the full epic in his next book, Ulysses. Having mastered the epic, he then spent 17 years, the remaining years of his life, writing Finnegans Wake, a book that is unclassifiable. It is, in effect, Joyce's own genre. Joyce never repeated a form. He always moved forward to mastering the next artistic challenge. And we might think this could be one definition of genius. Now, I'll have 2 more lectures this week to talk about Dubliners, and 2 more lectures to talk about Portrait, but I've only got about 10 minutes to talk about Ulysses. And then a little bit of time to deal with Finnegans Wake. Never fear, I can do it. What I would like to impress upon you about Ulysses is nothing more than this. Of all the books I have ever read in my years as a professor of English, Ulysses is the most moving, the most intimate, the most profoundly human of them all. Beyond the complexity, the technique, the difficulty, the dozens of different styles, the irony, the authorial poses, it is a timeless story of a man and a woman and a young man encountering the world and the issues we all face: love, loss, doubt, passion, and a puzzling over our most fundamental relationships to each other, to nation, and to God. Again, Joyce once said, "With me, the thought is always simple. Ulysses is a profoundly simple story." He wrote Ulysses between the years 1914 to 1921. He was working as a sort of part-time English teacher or tutor in the Berlitz schools in Trieste. And basically he would meet with his students and chat with them in English for an hour and ask to be paid. And his students, most of them really liked him. He was very entertaining. He told great stories. He would ask them questions because he always wanted to learn more about their lives, about Trieste, about Italy. But that was how he was sort of supporting himself and his family. It was really his long-suffering brother Stanislaus, who followed him to Trieste and really worked as a teacher, who supported Joyce and Nora really all the way until about 1917, 1918, by which time Joyce was getting a little money from publication rights and much more money from patronage. And the great modernist poet Ezra Pound, companion and colleague of Yeats, was the first to really recognize Joyce's genius and to secure substantial patronage for Joyce so that he no longer had to teach. From about 1915 onward, he was writing full-time. That's all that he ever did. Not only did they not have much money, they couldn't manage, I mean, a 4-year-old could manage money better than Joyce and Nora. Whatever they had, they spent, and if they didn't have money, they went on credit, and when the landlords tried to get them to pay, they would move to another apartment or flat, a trick Joyce had learned from his own father in Dublin, staying one step ahead of the landlords. If he had any money at all, he would spend it either on drink or on Nora, in particular, the hats and dresses that Nora adored. And they would live a fine life for as long as they could. So he is in real poverty, but sort of blithely uncaring about that as he writes this book. He began it in the Austro-Italian seaport town of Trieste, continued it in Zurich, Switzerland, where they went to escape the ravages of the war, and finished it in Paris. During most of its composition, World War I was raging all around him, as was the Easter Rising in Dublin and the Irish War of Independence. Ulysses is a book rife with warfare. Even though it is set in 1904, a decade before the war begins, the background of war is everywhere in this book, especially in its avowedly anti-war ethos. It is a profoundly pacifistic book. It is a book about peace. And Joyce saw it very much as an alternative to the carnage raging about him. After the war, someone asked Joyce what he had done to help the war effort. And Joyce scornfully replied, "I wrote Ulysses. What did you do?" So he really saw the book as a kind of counter to the world of the war and its cataclysmic events. It is also a book intimately informed by Joyce's own personal circumstances. Joyce and Nora were living in Europe, where he'd written Dubliners and Portrait. They had a son and then a daughter, while he taught English intermittently. So when he began Ulysses in 1914, he was 32 years old, a father, in essence a husband, though they didn't marry until the early 30s, essentially the bourgeois figure he would depict in his hero, Leopold Bloom. He is no longer the impassioned artist figure, Stephen Dedalus, of A Portrait of the Artist. And Ulysses shows Joyce shifting his sympathies from Stephen to Leopold Bloom. If Portrait is a young man's book, Ulysses is a book of maturity. It is concerned with marriage, with fatherhood, with citizenship, with home and homeland. So what then is Ulysses really about? I can tell you in about 3 minutes all the major themes, characters, and ideas of the book. Again, it's not that complicated a book in a certain way. It's set in a single day, indeed less than 24 hours, from the morning of June 16, 1904, into the early hours of the next day, June 17th. Which is actually my birthday, and I'm convinced that that's, Joyce was looking ahead to honoring that. Why June 16th? Because that's the day when Joyce and Nora had their first date in Dublin. He wanted to commemorate their first walk along the Grand Canal. So, first love, the start of romance, is somehow at the very heart of this book. It has three main characters, although there are hundreds of characters populating the book. Leopold and Molly Bloom, a couple married for about 16 years who have a teenage daughter and who lost their only son, Rudy, in infancy 10 years before. Since that loss, they have not made love. This is the great trauma that they cannot get past, that has blocked their love and their relationship. On this day, Molly will have a sexual affair with another man, and Bloom knows this. And indeed, he stays away from the house all day and most of the night to allow her to have this liaison. Then there's the young man Stephen Dedalus, Joyce's artist figure. But Stephen in this book is in mourning for the death of his mother, and he has been unable to fulfill the artistic promises of his youth. And those who read Portrait as showing, the map for becoming a great artist are very troubled by Ulysses, where that map seems to have taken Stephen quite off course. Like the characters in Dubliners, Stephen is paralyzed, constantly in motion yet unable to move. On this June 16th morning, Leopold leaves the house for work. He has many encounters and meetings throughout the day. Eventually, he meets up with Stephen, who's also wandered far in Dublin that day. As the night goes on, the two will return to the Bloom house very late after Molly has had her affair. Eventually, Stephen will leave back into the early morning city, and it ends with Leopold and Molly lying in bed together and Molly contemplating their past, present, and future. These characters align with the central figures in Homer's great epic, the Odyssey. Odysseus, the questing hero, Penelope, his faithful wife, and Telemachus, the son seeking his father and yearning to emerge into full manhood. So Ulysses has this careful architectural parallel alignment with the Odyssey. Many of the characters are modern-day versions of Homer's characters. Each of the book's 18 episodes correspond with key events in Homer's work. And Joyce worked assiduously to parallel every element of his book with details in Homer. And there are these famous schema where Joyce shows how every character and color and symbol and technique has its parallel in Homer's Odyssey. Yet Joyce's book is also so different from Homer's. To take the most obvious example, Leopold Bloom, his 20th century Odysseus, is no epic seafaring warrior hero. He sells advertisements in Dublin. He goes to various businesses throughout the day and he tries to place their ads in local Dublin newspapers. And he's not even very good at this. He walks all over Dublin on this day, mimicking Odysseus's epic journey, but going nowhere. And his faithful Penelope? Molly Bloom spends the day preparing for a sexual affair with another man, and while Leopold is out, the affair recurs. Hardly the Penelope of Homer's epic. So is Joyce's attitude towards the ancient world wholly one of irony? Is he saying that in the 20th century we can offer only pale imitations, even comic distortions of epic heroism? Is he saying that the modern world is a fallen, diminished, anti-heroic world without the great honor and significance of the ancient past? Perhaps. And yet, in many respects, Leopold Bloom is every bit as heroic as Homer's Odysseus. Bloom is charitable. He assists others, especially those most in need. He always thinks of others before himself. He exhibits selflessness. He is patient. He is kind. He is merciful. He is a true icon of those virtues extolled in the New Testament, which Joyce saw breaking down in the world all around him. Bloom is even loving towards the wife who he knows will betray him that day, for he understands that Molly is longing for the physical passion that he cannot give to her. In a way, he allows her this affair as a gift from him, to help in her own recovery after the death of their child. And even Molly, despite her affair on this day, affirms Bloom at the end. She approves his manhood over that of his rival, and in a sense reasserts her faithfulness to him. This is a new concept of heroism, not the heroism of martial prowess and the test of combat. Joyce had seen where that heroism leads in the slaughter of the trenches. The heroism needed for the modern world lay in the virtues that Leopold Bloom exhibits. In effect, this is the solution to the modern condition of alienation and exile, making Ulysses almost a sort of secular gospel. Now, when the book appeared in 1922, it made James Joyce the most celebrated and admired writer in modern Europe. Writers would come to Paris to meet Joyce and to learn from the master. Writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, eager to meet the great James Joyce. Ulysses became the Bible of modernism, the pinnacle achievement of the era and the measure for all others' works. No Joyce, no William Faulkner, no Toni Morrison. We could go on with the literary genealogy. How could Joyce follow up on such a work? That next year, he began his next project, a mysterious text that he would only refer to as work in progress, as he labored on it for the next 17 years. And though he would publish excerpts of it over the years as work in progress, only Nora was told the title, and she told nobody. This book would become Finnegans Wake. So what sort of book is Finnegans Wake? How is it structured? How does it work? One of Joyce's fundamental ideas for the Wake is that if Ulysses is his book of the day, that long day of Bloomsday, June 16th of 1904, then Finnegans Wake would be his book of the night. Put differently, Ulysses is a book of waking consciousness. Indeed, it is the richest rendering of human consciousness in literary history, through that stream of consciousness technique that Joyce developed, and then through all the other styles and techniques of the book. These are all Joyce's efforts in Ulysses to find adequate representations of the human mind, of how we process and interpret and then represent our world to ourselves and to others. That's a very ambitious task, and it's one reason why Ulysses is so complicated, because the human mind, of course, is so complicated. But increasingly he realized that our waking consciousness is only part, and actually a very small part, of how the mind works. At night, in sleep, in our dreams, our consciousness is working all the time, and perhaps in more fundamental and revealing ways than during the day. And this, of course, is quite consonant with the insights of psychoanalysis that were virtually contemporary with Joyce. Freud's theories of the unconscious and the subconscious, where our deepest drives, instincts, desires, and fears are revealed in coded symbolic manner through dreams. And Jung's theories of the mythic archetypes that we all share on a collective unconscious level. These are highly Joycean insights. Particularly that our deepest reservoirs of meaning are hidden beneath the conscious mind, and that all humanity shares a number of basic recurring archetypal traits that we all see in our dreams. So Joyce wrote Finnegans Wake as the long, extended dreaming of not one person like Joyce or Bloom or Stephen or Molly, but of every person. It is the dream of the every man and every woman, of the unconscious of all humanity. The book is also the dream of one man, Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker, who is the keeper of a pub in the village of Chapelizod, just up the Liffey from the center of Dublin. His wife is Anna Livia Plurabelle, and they have 3 children, a daughter Isabel and twin sons Shem and Sean. So it's another book of family. the early 20th century version of the eternal family. Husband and wife, warring brothers, enticing daughter. Earwicker is all father's time out of mind. In his comic aspects, he is concerned with managing his wife and daughter. He's concerned with the constant bickering of his sons. He's worried about his little pub business. He's concerned about growing old. He notices his prurient desires for younger women, and he fears failure in work, love, and sex. And at the same time, and by the way, there's no ending and no beginning to Finnegans Wake, so everything is always happening at the same time, just as time collapses in our dreams. At the same time, Earwicker is every mythic father figure. In the Irish tradition, he's the great warrior hero Finn McCool. In the biblical tradition, he is Noah, Abraham, and Moses, lawgivers, tribal leaders, ruthless punishers, and commanding warriors. Throughout the book, he will assume endless identities in this role. Similarly, Anna Livia stands for or becomes all wife mothers in history, religion, and myth. She is Penelope, Mary, Sarah, Rachel, Clytemnestra, Frigg, Bridget, etc. Now, we saw a version of this in Ulysses where Bloom is analogous to Odysseus and Molly is analogous to Penelope. But in Finnegans Wake, it's not analogy, it's identity. Earwicker is Moses and Olivia is Miriam, while also still being a Dublin publican and his wife. Similarly with Shem and Sean, the twin sons, they stand for all the warring sons in myth and religion and history. Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Thor and Loki, Romulus and Remus. And they're also the dualistic oppositions in all human culture. Change versus stasis, devil versus angel, city versus nature, time versus space, Jew versus Christian, the exiled artist versus the bourgeois citizen, and many more. They're also the two halves of their father, the oppositions that war within every man. And Isabel, or Izzy, the daughter, she's partly a younger version of her mother and will supplant her eventually. She's also the object of desire by her father, who fantasizes about an incestuous relationship with the girl that will restore his virility. She is also split in her own personality. She sees her opposite self in the mirror and wants to project her sinful self onto that other, purer self to retain her own innocence. And she reflects Joyce's own daughter, Lucia, who suffered from schizophrenia and descended into madness during the 1930s, during the very decade when Joyce was completing Finnegans Wake. And that title, Finnegans Wake, comes from a well-known Irish drinking song. Tim Finnegan is a working man with a daily fondness for whiskey. One day his fondness causes him to fall from the ladder where he is working. He lands on his head and appears to be dead. So you get the whole motif of the fall. His friends lay out his corpse and commence the traditional Irish wake, complete with excess of drink. Soon the merriment turns to riot, and a bottle of whiskey, which in Irish is Uisce Beatha, the water of life, shatters above the corpse. When the whiskey splashes on Tim, he miraculously revives and joins in his own party. And the final stanza of the song gives voice to the great resurrection theme Joyce employs throughout the book. Bedad, he revives, see how he rises, and Timothy, rising from the bed, says, whirl your liquor around like blazes, Thanamun do you think I'm dead? So this is where Joyce gets the title for arguably the most ambitious, complex, far-reaching work of literature in Western culture, a rough and bawdy Irish drinking song. This is funny, and it's meant to be. Finnegans Wake is a profoundly humorous book. Recall that Ulysses finally turns away from tragedy and, like Shakespeare's mature comedies or Dante's ultimate vision, embraces the life-affirming, regenerative spirit of divine comedy. This is even more true of Finnegans Wake, which, though it is filled with falls and deaths and apocalyptic thunderous destruction, always begins again with life and an affirmation of the indomitability of the life principle. This pattern of rising, falling, dying, and rising again is the fundamental human pattern, the nativity, crucifixion, resurrection pattern of Christianity and of all mythic religions, the fall of all heroes and gods, including Satan, Adam, Noah, Kronos, Prometheus, as well as Parnell, Napoleon, Richard III, Finn McCool, Cuchulainn. The list is literally endless. And in Joyce's scheme, all these falling figures rise again, then repeat their falls in endless cyclic succession. For a wake is both the watch over the corpse and the awakening of that corpse to new life. In short, Joyce's final work is a grand parable of the ultimate triumph of life and love over death and despair. Thank you. We are right on time, 10 o'clock, 10 minutes for questions, and then the all-important group photo. Yes, Dennis.
We talked about this, I remember in Hemingway, that Hemingway and Joyce went out to bars together and that sort of thing. Did Hemingway view that as a pupil-to-teacher situation, or teacher-to-pupil, and how did Fitzgerald view that relationship?
Hemingway absolutely viewed himself as learning from Joyce in every respect. He first came to Paris to learn at the feet of Gertrude Stein. And Hemingway's pattern was to learn whatever a rival author had to teach him and then crawl over the body of that author to become greater himself, which is certainly a model of artistic rivalry and succession. The one author for whom he never did attain that mastery was Joyce. The Hemingway-Fitzgerald story is a story of Hemingway attaining mastery over Fitzgerald. And then Fitzgerald turns the tables in the 1930s, or tries to in certain ways, certainly. But Hemingway felt him, I mean, he literally would take notes after a meeting or an evening with Joyce. He was so eager to learn from this great author.
Fitzgerald relate to Joyce?
Fitzgerald was more established by the time he met Joyce. He didn't meet Joyce until The Great Gatsby had come out. And now we're in the mid-20s, and by that time, Joyce is becoming quite aloof and really does not want to spend time talking to drunken expatriate Americans, and did not have a whole lot of interest in a figure like Fitzgerald. Joyce was disappointing for many people to meet with. There's a great story about Joyce and Marcel Proust were finally brought together in an evening soiree. And everyone thought, oh, wow, these two great masters of modern narrative, what will they talk about? And they just sat in a corner for about 20 minutes together. Joyce complained about how much his stomach hurt. Proust complained about his terrible headaches, and then they went home. So, you know, some authors you'd love to spend an evening with. Shakespeare would be great to go out with and spend some time with. Most geniuses are you know, the genius is internal, and there's not a whole lot that they're able to share or want to spend the energy in sharing. Yeah, Rick.
Speaking of Joyce being aloof, that encounter with Proust, you clearly have read Finnegans Wake. That's one of the many impressive things about you.
If anything's impressive, it's probably that, yes.
When I was an adolescent, a friend told me I had to read Stuart Gilbert along with Ulysses, and that was extremely helpful. Is there such a book to guide us through Finnegans Wake?
There are actually many, many books that purport to be that skeleton key to Finnegans Wake. Ulysses, I always tell my students, you can read Ulysses start to finish on your own, without the guides and the cribs and you can get through it. You miss a lot. You can. You miss a lot, but you can put it together. Finnegans Wake, I think it's, why do that is almost my sin. Now people do it. I first read Finnegans Wake in a graduate seminar with a great scholar, Hazard Adams, and we spent 10 weeks going through the book with guides and lectures and ancillary materials and doing research, so I kind of got the whole. Then I reread it twice more and wrote a chapter in my dissertation on it, and there it has sat for me ever since. I think it's awfully difficult to get what's happening there without the support of books. The first book that came out is called The Skeleton's Key to Finnegans Wake, written by Joseph Campbell and Campbell and Robinson. What's Robinson's first name? I can't remember. But Joseph Campbell, the great author of myth, his first book was a study of Finnegans Wake. And Campbell really got it. I mean, he understood. Joyce is talking about dreams and the unconscious and mythic archetypes. And Campbell already was so versed in comparative anthropology that he could see the patterns that Joyce was working with. There's another scholar, Roland McHugh, who is a botanist. And he got interested in Finnegans Wake. Lots of scientists get into Finnegans Wake because of all the classifications and categories and mysteries and puzzles. And McHugh got obsessed with it, and he's written annotations to Finnegans Wake. It's Manhattan phone book thick, and it goes page by page and glosses the different languages. And one of the things Joyce does is he takes multiple words in different languages that mean the same thing, and he puts them together into a kind of new word. He's very influenced by the portmanteau word that Lewis Carroll coins in, that's what Humpty Dumpty speaks, portmanteau words, where you cram words together into a suitcase. Joyce would do that, but with multiple languages. So McHugh glosses those and translates those. So it's very helpful to have that as you work on others. There are famous seminars and reading groups on Finnegans Wake. There's one at Oxford that's been going on for decades. Scholars gather every week. They do one page, and hopefully you've got maybe 10 different languages at the table, so you can kind of puzzle out what the languages are. A reading group is probably the best way to go through Finnegans Wake. Joyce said it's the ideal book for the ideal reader suffering from the ideal insomnia. If you want to go to sleep, a page of Finnegans Wake will either do it, or it'll get you so excited that you become obsessed and it takes over your life.
Well, thank you. My question, going back to his being aloof, was to what extent did he want to be understood? To what extent was he ambivalent about being understood?
He desperately wanted to be understood, and this is sort of charming. He couldn't understand why people were struggling with his books. In 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland and World War II was beginning, Joyce said, "How can they be starting it all over again? Haven't they read my book?" And sure, Goebbels is reading Finnegans Wake, right? And it's going to change his life. But he saw it as a book that explained why there's conflict and showed us how generous, creative, loving relationships will overcome he really believed that. He became so self-consumed with the writing of the book and with his own family dramas and struggles. I think it was very difficult for him to see outside of it. He also was becoming blind. It's very interesting to think about Finnegans Wake as a book that is being written by a man who is losing the ability to read words on the page. He had dozens of these gruesome early 20th century eye operations. He would have to have people read to him. He would struggle to see the words on the page. So Finnegans Wake, it's sort of being written in his head, and then he would have people help him write parts of it out and so forth. So there's a number of theories about how the diminished eyesight actually enabled the writing of the book in certain ways.
When he was writing Finnegans Wake, were there any chemicals involved? Like, drugs or alcohol?
No, well, right. There's chemicals and there's chemicals. So no, there was never any drug use by Joyce. He was a drinker and a bad drinker. He had very little tolerance for alcohol. Did not exhibit alcoholic behavior to this extent. He did not write while drunk. He would do his work and then drink. But his drinking certainly affected his health. So to that extent, it interfered with his work. But very unlike Fitzgerald, for example, who felt he wrote better when he had had 10 drinks, and in fact did not. He did his best work when he was sober. Different from Hemingway. Well, similar to Hemingway would work, and then he would drink, and then get up and work, and then drink. But so Joyce certainly struggled with alcohol. But he was not inebriated in the writing. Quite the contrary. All of his writing is stone cold sober. Yeah, Bob.
I'm interested because in Dubliners there are some derogatory remarks about Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And Leopold Bloom, of course, is Jewish.
Yes, excellent question. The derogatory remarks are are being spoken by characters and perspectives that are certainly not Joyce's. Joyce was fascinated with Judaism, had a number of very close friends in Trieste who themselves were Jewish, felt great empathy with Jewish theology, commitment to family, cultural values, and of course very much identified with the Jews as an oppressed people, like the Irish, and like so many of the people with whom Joyce identified. So he makes his modern-day Odysseus a Jew who had converted to Catholicism, but didn't really believe in Catholicism, selling advertisements in Dublin in the early 1900s, because the Jews were the wandering people, and the people of exile, and the people of wandering and return. And he saw in the Jewish people, like in the Greeks, he saw this sort of emblem of what the modern world needed to confront and to understand. So anti-Semitism to Joyce was repugnant, as were all racisms and anything that would castigate people on the basis of that sort of identity. Now, there's a lot of stuff in his books that are of his culture and his time. There's a passage in Ulysses that is difficult in the current climate to teach because of the words that it uses from American vernacular. But you know, as we always try to teach our students, we have to see those through the lens of history and perspective. Yes, one more question, then we'll take our break.
One work that you omitted was Exile.
I did. Good for you. Points. Joyce wrote a play, Exiles, finished in 1917. It always gets left out. I was going to put it in. It just confuses things. Really interesting. You know, it's a good play. And if you see it produced, you know, it's got some drama to it. He was not a playwright. It's just that was not his gift. Exiles is especially interesting if you know a lot about Joyce's biography, and you can see him working out, especially his marital struggles and his struggles with Ireland, which are sort of inseparable because Nora stood for Ireland for Joyce in so many ways. And he had a love-hate relationship with Ireland, so and with Nora, love-hate. But Exiles, he's really trying to work that out. This artist figure who's going to be unfaithful to his wife. All this stuff is worked out in Exiles. I just left it out. He did write a play. Please put that in your notes so nobody thinks I don't know about it. But I decided it was just going to, and this is what most Joyceans do. Like at the Trieste School on Joyce, you got a workshop on Finnegans Wake, workshop on Ulysses, portrait Dubliners. I did one on the poetry. I don't think anyone's ever done one on Exiles. No one wants to spend a week on that play. It's great, it's interesting, but yeah, there it is. All right, thanks so much. So picture, yeah.